I think it's very, very ill-advised for a president of the United States to claim that a war is over when it has only just begun.
They told you the war with Iran is over. They declared it a complete success. What you are about to hear will shatter everything you've been told. A former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense is coming forward to expose the official story as a dangerous, calculated lie. This is the forbidden knowledge the establishment is praying you never see. He claims the celebrated U.S. strikes were nothing more than a staged PR stunt. Prepare yourself. You are about to learn the real story mainstream sources will not tell you, that the war has only just begun, that the U.S. military is being pushed to its breaking point, and that the official narrative is a cover for something far more sinister. Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're the place you come to cut through the noise, to really get to the heart of what's actually happening behind the headlines. And today, we are diving deep into a really profound contrast, a huge disconnect surrounding the recent Israel-Iran conflict. So on one side, you have this official narrative strongly pushed by President Trump of mission accomplished, the idea that hostilities are over, decisive victory achieved. But then, on the complete other side, there's this, frankly chilling insider claim. It comes from Colonel Doug Macgregor. He's a former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. And he's saying, point blank, the war has only just begun. And, maybe more disturbingly, that the public, that you, have been fundamentally misled. So our mission today really is to unpack these two completely clashing viewpoints. We need to sift through the evidence that's out there, the official statements, the leaks, Macgregor's own analysis, and try to help you figure out what the real implications are. Implications for global stability, for the strategic picture moving forward, and this is the tough part, for a hidden humanitarian crisis that might be way bigger than we generally understand. We'll be looking really closely at the official lines, those intelligence leaks, and Macgregor's pretty candid assessments. We're drawing right from the source material we've got, trying to give you the unfiltered picture.
Yeah, it's genuinely fascinating, isn't it, how you can get two such drastically different stories emerging from, ostensibly the same set of events. This deep dive, I think, it's really going to compel us and you listening to question not just what we're being told, but maybe more importantly, why? Why do these differences exist, and how do they really impact that bigger geopolitical chessboard? We'll need to explore the strategic thinking, the motivations maybe behind these very public statements, and really consider the consequences, the fallout, when official stories diverge so sharply from these alternative assessments that you could argue might be more grounded in reality. It forces you to look past from what Macgregor actually calls political theater.
Okay, so let's start right there with that official narrative. The contradiction really begins at the top, with President Trump. He was incredibly definitive, wasn't he? In his public statements about the Iran conflict, he declared complete success. He even used that really strong word, obliteration, talking about Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Very strong language, yes, implying total destruction.
Exactly. And according to those official statements, specific facilities were destroyed. Iran's nuclear ambitions set back many years. That was the claim.
Many years. That's a significant time frame.
And some sources even say he made that comparison to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is, it's a stark analogy.
It certainly paints a picture of absolute, decisive incapacitation, an end to the immediate threat. The message couldn't be clearer, really. Iran's program dealt a crippling long-term blow.
And like you said, it wasn't just him saying this. This narrative got amplified.
Oh, definitely. Key figures in the administration, allies too, they all echoed it.
You had Secretary Marco Rubio publicly backing this view, and prominent Israeli officials.
Right. People like Eyal Zamir, head of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, and Israel's military chief of staff, they were quite certain.
They were saying critical infrastructure, like at Fordo, that's the big underground enrichment site, was destroyed, rendered inoperable.
The Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, specifically, I think they were quoted saying, the combined strikes set back Iran's weapons capability by many, many years. So directly backing up Trump's assessment.
So it was presented not just as, political spin, but as a verified military fact, a game changer for the region. And then, to sort of cap it all off, President Trump announced these upcoming talks with Iran.
But the framing was interesting, wasn't it?
Very. Not as negotiations between equals, but more like dictating terms. From a position of overwhelming strength, supposedly. The demand was non-negotiable. Iran stops all nuclear weapons activity. Completely. Verifiably.
And what about the deal itself? He seemed almost indifferent.
Exactly. He said publicly he doesn't care if a formal deal is signed, which implies that the military strikes already did the real work.
Precisely. That the core objective, neutralizing the nuclear threat, was already achieved. Any talks now are just about formalizing Iran's, well, submission.
The message was crystal clear. Conflict over, we won, now here are the terms.
And that is exactly where Colonel Macgregor just blows that narrative wide open.
Yeah.
It's an immediate, stark contradiction. He didn't just quibble over details. He offered this really emphatic, direct rebuttal. He stated very clearly, it is very, very ill-advised for a president to claim that a war is over when it has only just begun.
Only just begun. I mean, that's a 180-degree turn from mission accomplished.
Completely. It's not just a disagreement on, say, tactical success. It's a fundamental disagreement about the entire nature and direction of the conflict. Macgregor believes we're not seeing the end. He thinks we're seeing the start of a much longer period of conflict. How long, how it ends, he admits that's uncertain.
So he thinks these declarations of victory are actually dangerous.
Worse than just wrong, yeah. Strategically misguided, actively dangerous, because they set expectations that don't match reality. And he goes further. He says Trump's description of what happened is simply not true. He calls it confusing and incoherent, even dismisses it flat out as nonsense.
Wow. That is incredibly direct, especially coming from someone with his background, former senior advisor to the SecDef.
It's a profound challenge, directly questioning the president's version of events. Macgregor does speculate, maybe Trump genuinely believes what he's saying.
Like, based on the intel he's getting or choosing to hear?
Perhaps. But Macgregor makes this critical point. You can't just wish things into reality, especially not in international relations. That sort of thinking, he argues, is a dangerous self-delusion. It sets you up for future mistakes.
So the implication is this huge gap.
A profound and potentially perilous gap between the public story and the strategic reality on the ground. Trump says, obliteration, setback of many years. Macgregor says, quote, we did not destroy the nuclear development capability. That's nonsense. He acknowledges some people might buy the done and wonderful job line.
But he's saying the reality is completely different.
Far from it, in his view. And that raises huge questions, doesn't it? About the information the public is getting versus the actual situation in a really volatile region. The key insight he's offering is that this supposed end is actually just the start of something much more complex, dangerous, and likely drawn out. And that initial flawed assessment could lead to more escalation down the line.
Okay, so that leads us right to the core question. How effective were these strikes, especially when you hear such different stories from inside the U.S. intelligence community itself? On one side, you've got these very confident official claims, obliteration, many years, setback, bold statements from the top.
Right. Clear, decisive language.
But then, this leaked report surfaces. A preliminary classified report from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA.
And it painted a very different picture.
Massively different. Instead of many years, the DIA report suggested the setback was maybe only a few months.
A few months versus many years. That's not a small discrepancy. That's a chasm.
It's almost like describing two different events, isn't it? It forces you, the listener, to ask, what's the real story here? Which version is closer to the truth? And that huge difference going from this long-term knockout blow to just a temporary stumble, it's jarring.
And how did the administration react to the leak?
Swiftly. They dismissed the DIA report, called it inconclusive. Expressed frustration it got out to the media at all.
Which, dismissing it rather than engaging with it, that makes you wonder about the motives, doesn't it?
It certainly raises questions. And then you have the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. They reported localized radioactive releases, confirming some impact, clearly.
But they weren't sure about the full extent of the damage either. Exactly. And that uncertainty got amplified because Iran then suspended cooperation with the IAEA, barred inspectors.
Making independent verification almost impossible.
Right, so you've got these layers, conflicting reports, official dismissals, lack of transparency. It just fuels the suspicion that maybe the official story is being very carefully managed, perhaps deliberately. And this whole situation, it really brings up a critical question for any country, really. What actually happens to your strategic decision-making when the very people tasked with giving you accurate intelligence are either, as Macgregor puts it, blindsided or maybe worse, just ignored?
That's Macgregor's core argument, isn't it? That the U.S. intelligence community was basically bypassed.
That's his very strong claim, yes. He alleges President Trump decided to believe whatever the Israelis provided, possibly funneled through, quote, minions in the White House. and in doing so completely disregarded the analysis from his own nation's intelligence experts. That suggests a real breakdown in the process, where outside info gets prioritized over internal expertise. Macgregor actually uses some history here to make his point, which is interesting. He compares it to, say, Lyndon B. Johnson.
How so?
Well, LBJ also sometimes engaged in, let's call it selective hearing, dismissing intelligence that didn't fit his preferred narrative, often with terrible results, like in Vietnam.
Okay.
But he contrasts that sharply with Nixon and Kissinger, particularly during the SALT talks, the strategic arms limitation talks. Apparently, Nixon wasn't fully confident in the CIA's assessments at the time, so Kissinger did something quite proactive.
What was that?
He brought station chiefs, the people actually on the ground in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, directly to the White House. These were the folks living the reality 24/7.
So getting unfiltered, direct intel.
Exactly. And their assessments, straight from the field, were quite different from what the bureaucracy had been reporting up the chain. And that direct verification, prioritizing that field intelligence, led to more realistic, more effective arms control agreements.
So the point is that kind of rigorous verification was missing here.
That's what Macgregor implies. Yes. That overriding your own intelligence system with potentially biased external information without that kind of cross-checking is incredibly risky. You end up basing policy on wishful thinking, maybe, instead of hard facts. And you can really hear his concern for the morale within the U.S. intelligence community. It comes through strongly. He argues, look, when the difficult, painstaking work of these professionals gets dismissed out of hand, maybe for political reasons or because it doesn't fit a preferred narrative, it just erodes trust deeply.
It must be incredibly demoralizing.
Absolutely. It can create this culture where, telling the unvarnished truth is implicitly punished, where people start tailoring reports to what they think leaders want to hear.
And that undermines the whole system.
Precisely. It undermines the very foundation of sound strategy. It leaves the nation vulnerable to huge miscalculations because decisions are based on desired outcomes, not objective reality. The long-term damage, he suggests, could be immense.
Okay, this then leads us to probably Macgregor's most provocative claim, one that really challenges the whole idea of a decisive military win. He actually asserts that these celebrated U.S. strikes were, quote, more of a PR stunt or staged event or simply political theater.
That's incredibly strong language, political theater.
It is. And he doesn't just throw it out there. He offers details that, if they're accurate, you have to admit, lend some weight to this really unsettling idea. He claims the strikes were announced before we went in. Announced.
Meaning Iran knew?
Yes. He claims Iran was given 2 hours notice. 2 hours, which, if true, completely changes the nature of the operation, doesn't it? It's not a surprise attack, it's something else. A demonstration, maybe? And to back this up, he points to what happened during the strikes. He says there was no pushback from the integrated air defense systems in Iran.
No resistance.
Critically, he says, no missiles were fired by Iran in response right at the moment of impact. Which seems odd, right, if you're under major attack.
You'd expect a significant response, wouldn't you? Especially given Iran's capabilities.
Exactly. It suggests maybe a deliberate lack of engagement. Or maybe some kind of prearrangement.
And it takes it further, doesn't he? About the targets themselves.
Yes. He states his belief that the sites that were hit were effectively empty.
Empty, meaning not hitting critical active infrastructure.
Implying they hit pre-cleared targets, maybe non-essential buildings, things that looked good on camera but didn't actually cripple anything important. And he ties all this back to what he sees as a pattern in U.S. government behavior, this tendency to grandstand about military power, often for political reasons or as a distraction.
So the core idea here is really disturbing.
It is. If Macgregor is right, then this whole victory, hailed as an obliteration, might have been choreographed.
Designed less for real strategic effect and more for how it played back home, for the headlines.
That's the implication. Less about military reality, more about public perception, managing the narrative.
And that's the heart of his expose, really. The idea that the American public, that you, are being deliberately misled about what actually happened and what it means, turning complex reality into a show. And what's really interesting here is the way Macgregor portrays Iran's intentions in all this, the asymmetry you could call it. He states quite clearly his view is that Iran is not interested in a war with us, meaning the United States.
Despite all the rhetoric, he thinks they want to avoid direct conflict with the U.S.
That's his perspective. He argues the Iranian leadership has consistently done everything in its power to avoid provoking us, the U.S. He gives examples like allegedly choosing targets known to be evacuated. He mentions the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and even giving warnings beforehand specifically to avoid direct confrontation with American personnel. He suggests that even when Iran did retaliate, it was carefully calculated, designed to respond to provocations, yes, but without crossing that line into all-out war with America, trying not to give the U.S. a clear reason, a casus belli, to launch a full-scale attack.
So this reframes Iran quite significantly, doesn't it? Not as this inherently aggressive force always looking for a fight with the U.S.
But maybe as a power acting with extreme caution in a very dangerous situation, trying to navigate it without getting drawn into a catastrophic war with a much stronger military. According to Macgregor, their warnings, their target selection, their overall approach, it all points to a leadership trying to de-escalate with Washington, even while caught up in these wider regional fights.
That really challenges the common narrative we hear.
It does. It suggests a more pragmatic, maybe survival-focused approach from Tehran, wanting to avoid that devastating direct conflict. The key insight is this potential asymmetry. Iran perhaps seeking de-escalation while other dynamics keep pulling them into conflict.
Okay, so if Iran isn't actually seeking war with the U.S., according to Macgregor, what does that mean for America's position? Where does this leave the U.S.?
Well, this is where Macgregor expresses really grave concern. He worries the U.S. is being drawn in even more into Israel's war.
Not just with Iran, but potentially broader.
Yes. He says increasingly the whole Muslim world. So it's shifting from seeing this as U.S. versus Iran or even U.S.-Israel versus Iran to the U.S. getting entangled in a much wider, potentially religious or civilizational conflict.
And he connects this to Israel's nuclear status.
Critically, he talks about Israel's nuclear monopoly in the region, the fact it has nuclear weapons, though unacknowledged, while its neighbors don't. He argues this monopoly acts as a foundation for hegemony. It allows Israel, in his view, to bully their neighbors because they have this ultimate deterrent that nobody else can match.
And the logic there for other countries in the region is...
Think about it from their perspective, Macgregor suggests. You're next door to a nuclear power that shows it's willing to use force, doesn't admit it has nukes, and resists efforts for a nuclear-free zone. If you don't have that same deterrent, you're always vulnerable.
So it creates an incentive for them to get nukes, too.
That's his argument. He says the incentive for other regional powers to get nuclear weapons is now greater than it's ever been. The lesson of all of this, as he puts it quite chillingly, is if you have a nuclear weapon, the United States and its friend Israel don't attack you.
Wow. So the action's meant to stop proliferation.
Might ironically be speeding it up.
Yeah.
By demonstrating the perceived value of having that ultimate weapon, especially given Israel's unique position.
So the deep insight here is that the U.S. might be getting tangled in something much bigger and inadvertently fueling the very arms race it wants to prevent.
And this ties into another critical area Macgregor raises, the actual readiness of the U.S. military right now, which leads to a pretty important question for you, the listener, to consider. If his claims about our supply chains, our manufacturing base, are accurate, what does that mean for future conflicts? What are the strategic implications?
What are his specific claims about readiness?
Well, he points to the sheer amount of munitions used recently, firing hundreds of missiles from our destroyers, he says, in support of Israel's defense against Iran.
Okay, a lot of missiles fired.
Right. And his claim is that this level of expenditure means the U.S. is about out of certain critical types. These ships literally have to go back to port to reload. That shows a real vulnerability in a sustained fight. He also mentions the Tashed batteries. Those are the terminal high-altitude area defense systems on the ground for missile defense.
Yes.
He claims they had to fire virtually everything it has in recent exchanges, again suggesting a very rapid burning through of expensive, limited ammo.
But it's deeper than just firing a lot, isn't it? He talks about production issues.
Yes, and this seems to be the more fundamental systemic problem he's highlighting, a real problem with rocket motors. This apparently affects key missiles like the Standard Missile 2 and 6. Those are vital naval air defense missiles, and the AMRAAM air-to-air missile.
And why is there a problem with rocket motors?
He blames two things: dependency on external sources for key components, and even more worryingly, a severely degraded domestic manufacturing base. The U.S. just can't build these things fast enough.
He gives numbers, doesn't he?
He does. He contrasts the U.S. managing to maybe increase production from 600 to 660 missiles a year with the capabilities of Russia and China, who he says can produce these kinds of weapons at a much, much higher rate.
So we talk a big game, but the industrial capacity isn't there.
That's his stark warning. For a supposed superpower, this is a serious fundamental problem. The industrial base has been allowed to degrade. He really emphasizes this point, that for a nation claiming to be a great power, this erosion of the industrial base is a core vulnerability. He explicitly says Russia and China don't face this particular problem to the same extent.
Which puts the U.S. at a disadvantage in any long fight.
A distinct strategic disadvantage, yes. If you're firing hundreds of missiles, depleting your stocks rapidly, but you can't replenish them quickly because your factories can't keep up, well, your ability to sustain high-intensity conflict is seriously compromised.
It paints a pretty grim picture of readiness.
It does. It suggests that the U.S. military might be getting stretched incredibly thin, pushed to its breaking point by these regional conflicts. And it raises serious questions about the long-term ability to project power globally. Maybe the grand pronouncements of military might be becoming hollow without that industrial backbone.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly, because Colonel Macgregor introduces something he calls a profound moral angle, something he clearly believes is being suppressed or ignored in a lot of the discussion. He points to this, frankly, shocking humanitarian situation, citing a Harvard-linked study.
Yes, the numbers he quotes are staggering.
Truly staggering. He says the study suggests Gaza's population has dropped from nearly 2.3 million people down to just 189,000.
An almost unbelievable drop.
And the casualty figures. The study apparently suggests as many as 400,000 Palestinians who've been killed or maimed. 400,000.
It's hard to even process numbers like that.
Macgregor is blunt about it. He says this is largely about killing. He uses the terms mass expel or murder to describe what he believes is happening in Gaza. And the crucial point he makes to give these figures credibility is where the study comes from.
Right. He stresses this isn't propaganda from Iran or China, something easily dismissed as disinformation.
No. He highlights its direct link to Harvard. He urges you to actually find it and read it, to understand how terrible this has been.
The insight here is really disturbing, isn't it?
It is, because it shifts the focus from just geopolitics and military strategy to this immense human cost. A potential catastrophe unfolding, as Macgregor sees it, largely in silence, or at least significantly downplayed in many mainstream sources.
It forces us to confront this stark reality, what he views as a hidden tragedy that's fundamental to understanding the whole regional dynamic.
And the lack of widespread awareness about these numbers, he implies, is a massive failure of reporting and attention.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, Macgregor's argument is pretty clear. You can't solve the wider regional conflict without addressing this. He sees it as foundational. He states very directly, this war is not over, and the war will not end until this Gaza war is ended. It's the core issue driving instability, in his view.
And he characterizes Israel's actions there how?
He makes a very grave accusation. He says the Jewish state does not simply want hegemony. It wants to dominate the region, but also, most important, it's trying to ethnically cleanse all those that it doesn't want inside its borders.
Ethnic cleansing, that's an incredibly serious charge.
Extremely serious. Framing the conflict in Gaza explicitly as a systematic effort to remove the Palestinian population. And then he brings the U.S. directly into it. He alleges American complicity.
How so?
He says bluntly, the United States is complicit in all of this and is helping this along, helping the alleged ethnic cleansing.
But he also says nobody's talking about it here.
That's his lament. No one is talking about it in the United States. This silence, this lack of public debate within the U.S., he sees as critical. Because, he points out, the rest of the world is watching. More people in Africa, Latin America, Asia are paying close attention, he claims.
And he mentions Putin is watching too.
Yes, explicitly. Suggesting that this perceived U.S. complicity isn't just a moral issue, it's strategically damaging. It fuels anti-American sentiment, potentially uniting adversaries, feeding into this narrative of a war with the whole Muslim world, and badly damaging U.S. credibility globally.
So the insight is that these perceived injustices, especially on this scale with alleged U.S. involvement, have massive global ripple effects, shaping alliances, breeding resentment, changing how the world sees America. So thinking about the broader implications, Macgregor is also pretty critical of President Trump's overall foreign policy approach, isn't he?
Oh, very critical. He basically characterizes it as reactive, lacking a coherent strategy.
Reactive how? What does he mean by that?
He suggests Trump's decision-making is very easily influenced by whoever spoke to him last. He says Trump listens very closely to the last person that speaks to him.
Which implies policy shifts based on the latest conversation, not a long-term plan.
Exactly. Less about a consistent vision, more about immediate influences. Macgregor sees Trump's actions often as mere impulses, not as carefully thought-out moves aimed at achieving specific, long-range goals.
And he gives examples of this inconsistency.
The shifting stance on NATO is a key one he points to. He reminds us, Trump used to talk about wanting to Europeanize NATO, basically, have the U.S. pull back, make Europe pay more, do more.
I remember that rhetoric.
But now, Macgregor notes, Trump has swung the other way. He's pushing NATO as a solution, emphasizing selling U.S. military gear to Europe, celebrating their increased defense spending as a great victory for him.
So a complete U-turn.
Which, for Macgregor, demonstrates this lack of a fixed guiding doctrine. It's more about immediate reactions, maybe transactional deals, than a grand strategy.
And the risk there is?
Unpredictability. Getting pulled into conflicts or making commitments without a clear strategic purpose or sustainable plan. Potentially significant and unforeseen consequences down the road. Which really brings us to this fundamental question about America's place in the world. How can a nation lead? How can it operate effectively when its credibility is damaged? When key players just don't trust its word anymore?
Macgregor feels U.S. credibility is seriously damaged.
Very much so. He says the U.S.'s reputation, it's so damaged now, and he partly blames perceived deceptions, like in the dealings with Iran. He talks about what he calls a deception plan involving the U.S. and Israel regarding negotiations.
What was the alleged deception?
His claim is that the Iranians were led to believe a deal involving some level of enrichment was possible. But actually, there was no intention on our part to reach any agreement that would include any enrichment at all. He says a U.S. official later confirmed this, essentially admitting the Iranians were misled. That kind of thing, Macgregor argues, makes future diplomacy incredibly difficult. Who's going to trust you next time? And he broadens this out. Saying things that are patently absurd and untrue, things that Russia knows aren't true, China knows aren't true, it just fundamentally undermines America's standing.
It makes it harder to get anything done internationally.
Absolutely. He connects it to real-world consequences. It won't help with the tariff mess, which he thinks hurt the U.S. economy enormously. It won't help with the fragility of our sovereign national debt. He even warns the bond market could blow up any minute, linking international distrust to potential domestic economic instability.
So what's the solution, in his view?
He calls for a little bit of humility, but then adds, rather pessimistically, we don't have it in our vocabulary as a nation.
The insight being that without rebuilding trust, without maybe a change in approach, the U.S. will really struggle on the global stage. Its influence and even its economic health are tied to its credibility. And just to bring this full circle, let's end by returning to that nuclear question. Because Colonel Macgregor makes a prediction here that's pretty sobering.
Extremely sobering. He predicts Iran will have a nuclear weapon quite soon.
Not just as a possibility, but as a near certainty.
That's how he frames it, as the logical outcome, the unavoidable lesson of all of this, for any country watching what's happened.
And that lesson is?
Simple and brutal in his view. If you have a nuclear weapon, the United States and its friend Israel don't attack you.
So it creates this powerful drive for other nations to get the bomb, directly undermining non-proliferation efforts.
Exactly. He sees it as creating an irresistible incentive.
And he predicts this will spread.
Yes. He says as a direct, almost inevitable consequence, you will see nuclear weapons in the hands of other countries in the Middle East.
He again points to Israel's position.
Right. Israel's refusal to join a nuclear-free zone, its desire for that monopoly as a foundation for hegemony, allowing it, he claims, to bully their neighbors without fear of nuclear retaliation.
So the alarming insight here is that the very policies and actions perhaps intended to stop Iran getting a bomb and maintain regional stability
might actually be pushing the entire region faster towards nuclear proliferation, creating this dangerous feedback loop, making the Middle East even more volatile as nuclear deterrence becomes the ultimate security goal for more states. What's really, I think, fascinating here when you step back is just this profound gap. The chasm between the declared results of the Israel-Iran conflict, that official story, and the alleged realities on the ground that an insider like Macgregor presents. This deep dive, it really has shown us, hasn't it, that these complex geopolitical events are almost never as simple or as finished as the official narratives want us to believe. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it just hammers home how critical it is for all of us, for you listening, to seek out different perspectives, to question the assumptions we're fed, especially when the stakes involve human lives on such a scale and the stability of the entire globe. These claims of deception, the vulnerabilities he points to, military readiness, international trust, they really demand a much closer, much more critical look from everyone. We have to get past the superficial headlines and really grapple with these underlying complexities.
So you've just heard our deep dive into a conflict that some are telling you is over and done with, while others, like Colonel Macgregor, are issuing this urgent warning that it has only just begun, and crucially that it's intertwined with a devastating humanitarian crisis that's largely hidden from view, with America, according to him, deeply entangled. So consider this as we wrap up. If that official story of mission accomplished truly is political theater, as Macgregor alleges, and if a humanitarian catastrophe of the scale he describes is unfolding largely in silence, what other forbidden knowledge about crucial global events might be shaping our world right now, completely without our awareness? And maybe more importantly, what is our responsibility, what is your responsibility in seeking out that knowledge? The truth, it certainly seems, is far more complex and maybe far more urgent than we are often led to believe.